So we're going to have a little bit of just a discussion around, you've heard us talk about it, the idea of this risk operations center. And, if you're like me, hopefully you're asking, well, what is it exactly? I think, you've heard Sumedh kind of lay out the foundations of it. But, when we really get into what does it mean to operationalize this, right? What does it mean to take this and develop playbooks and actions that teams would run? And the tools that they would use. Well, what does that look like? And then specifically, obviously, how does it apply to you in your job and in your mandate? So hopefully in this brief session, we'll be able to, give you some answers to those questions, hopefully that have been percolating there as we've had these sessions. And so maybe we'll start, obviously, is kind of the innovator, the brainchild of the Risk Operations Center. You can start and start kind of talking about what is it, like what exactly are the components, and
Certainly.
How does it work?
First of all, welcome everyone here. Certainly, I would like to dial the clock back a little bit in terms of why do we even need a Risk Operations Center, right? And where this concept really came about. Now, if you think about vulnerability management as a program, maybe 5-10 years ago, we were scanning the infrastructure, identifying here are the vulnerabilities, and sending it over for patch management, right? Simple as that. Now, over the last several years, what has happened is the attack surface has grown pretty significantly. I couldn't resist the passion on the stage before us about OT devices, and that's just one of the components, right? If you extend that further, OT environments, your cloud infrastructure, the digital transformation has actually pushed everything to the cloud with new digital asset types that come about that we need to manage, monitor, secure, right? Whether those are your cloud workloads, identities, SBOMs, AI, LLMs, whatever that is. And security industry is actually very notorious for coming up with specialized tooling to secure individual asset types, right? And that is where the security posture management sprawl has happened over the last several years. Now, this is where our customers, larger customers, are having to deal with not 1 million findings, but hundreds of millions of findings on a daily basis. It's not humanly possible to go and patch or mitigate them all. And this is where the concept of a risk operations center is absolutely needed, where you really need to figure out of these millions of signals, risk telemetry that is coming my way, I've got limited number of resources, as you oftentimes see within Qualys as well, right? You have got limited number of resources at your disposal. How do you point them in the right direction so that you can actually reduce the risk that matters to your organizations, your agencies the most? And that is where the concept of a risk operations center really is. Now, there are 3 key data sets that really make up for a risk operations center. One is naturally the risk telemetry that is detected by various scan engines or detection technologies that you might have deployed for each one of those specialized asset types. But then the second one is your threat intelligence, which is really understanding what the threat landscape looks like today, right? In real time. And finally, overlaying that with the business context to understand what is important for your agency, for your business, for your state department, for a local department. Putting these 3 ingredients into a centralized infrastructure really allows you to understand with the lens what is most important for the business today and where should I point my limited resources to. Hope that sort of gives you a brief background in terms of where this concept of a risk operations center really came about. Risk operations center, again, is a peacetime activity, whereas a security operations center is a wartime activity. It's more about cyber hygiene, and the persona who is really looking at how do you evaluate the risk signals is a lot different than the one who is really looking at how are you fighting a war in a SOC. Identifying the indicators of compromise.
Got it. Thank you.
Certainly. In fact, I want to take this opportunity and get your insights into how did you go about operationalizing a risk operations center at Qualys? This is indeed a transformation from the years of the past. So your insights into that would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the, before we ever had the I think idea of a risk operations center and what it looks like, talking across my leaders, across my different teams, one of the just kind of breakdowns that I saw, right, is you kind of have your governance, risk, and compliance team doing, risk assessments periodically. You've got your SOC team who's dealing with threats every day, constantly going on. And then usually you have some type of vulnerability management, exposure management team that again is operating outside of the SOC, outside of the GRC. And I think it was always my assumption that they're coordinating and fusing their information together. And the reality for me was they weren't, honestly, right? When I would go to the GRC and say, okay, why are you prioritizing these technology risk assessments? Well, because this was on our list, okay, but it's not reflective of the attacks that our SOC is dealing with. So why aren't you focusing on them? Well, we're not in the SOC, so we're not talking to them. We don't, we don't work with them every day. So that was completely separate. And then, similarly, when we were looking at vulnerabilities and which vulnerabilities we would prioritize, there again was really that no tie-in to, okay, well, where have we, at a macro, strategic, or operational level dictated that our biggest risks are? Okay, is it aligned to our patching program? Well, no, we just do this every 30 days. And if it's this, we do it every 60 days. And again, there was no real rational thought other than, listen, we have FedRAMP programs, so we have to follow FedRAMP. And so, basically we took what FedRAMP says. If it's CVSS this, then we do that. Okay, but is that the right thing, right? And I think, I question that. And so what we ended up doing is saying, well, let's start first by getting people together. And so instead of, we made a lot of room in a physical location, retitled it to a Cyber Fusion Center. But I made components of our GRC team sit with the SOC. I made components of our vulnerability management, exposure management, and patching group sit in the SOC. And then I made our SOC and incident responders start doing, daily stand-ups, briefings, so that everyone had a good picture. And while that sounds simple, it's just funny all the barriers you run into, right? Like, hey, what we deal with is super sensitive. We're in the SOC. We can't talk to the vulnerability management people. Like, yeah, BS, you can talk to them, right? Like they know all the vulnerabilities in our environment, so that's pretty sensitive too, right? And so, just breaking down some of those barriers to start. And then I think the next component became, do we have a comprehensive view of our technology risk, that we can quickly look at any given time, that's up to date, let's say in at least a 24-hour period. I think I've kind of given up on the real time. Real time is very difficult, very expensive. But do we have all that information available to us in roughly update cycles of every 24 hours? And then again, I really had to dig into that. And I think as the last panelist talked about, I would say, okay, well, yeah, here's our infrastructure vulnerabilities. Okay, great. Where is our AppSec vulnerabilities? Oh, that's a different team. I know it's a different team. Okay, where's the data? Can we look at the data? Oh, how about OT and our industrial IoT? Oh, that's a different group, different team, a different tool that does that. And so suddenly you realize, you're trying to glue together all of this, and that's just to get one picture of really, what you're talking about from a cybersecurity kind of technology risk perspective, and user risk, again, application level risk, infrastructure risk, cloud risk, OT risk, all of those combined. And I just wanted to focus on that. Forget the process side. There's always process risk, but let's consolidate and get to that. And so we really started working with the product team very closely and said, well, okay, what is the tool stack that we need, right? And so at that point, that's where it became clear that, we have to be able to connect into not just Qualys products, but third-party products. We need to be able to pull in, when we first started, we were pulling in risk data. And again, this one scores 100. This one's on a 0 to 10 scale. This one's on, up to 1,000. So then I have to try to normalize, right? We have to try to figure out what is truly high risk. And then even for us, at some point, we were bringing in our own external threat intelligence through a TIP. well, listen, that's costly, takes a lot of people, and so working with the product team, can we integrate that data already automatically without me and a large group of people doing that work? And so at the end of the day, we started building kind of this platform, and finally, once we got the people together, we got an operational picture. That was really the key. Now, the next step is, what do you do with that data?
Right.
And maybe you can talk a little bit too, like what's your vision around, hey, once you have this operational picture, like how do you make decisions with this data?
Certainly. And thanks for that background, actually. Putting all of these things together into a single platform is one thing, but really deriving insights out of it so that you can actually automate a few tasks. Like Shailesh was mentioning earlier, if there are vulnerabilities identified on a browser, why wait for anything, right? There can be an automation job that can actually go and in real time kick off the patching job for those. So it's more about when you have a volume of vulnerabilities and risks that we are trying to respond to. The idea of a risk operations center should always be in terms of what are the things out of these millions of signals that can potentially be automated from a risk management standpoint. These insights can oftentimes come from understanding the threat landscape, but more importantly, what is the impact on my business continuity because of these, right? Is there an operational impact? Are we taking that into consideration while automating these workflows within the platform, right? Those are some of the insights that are definitely derived out of a risk operations center. But one thing, while we were implementing a risk operations center at Qualys, one thing that was definitely noticeable, and your insights would be very helpful in terms of staffing, resourcing, a skill set, right? Was there a transition that was needed from the traditional approach to vulnerability and risk management towards this centralized, unified risk operations center?
Yeah, it's definitely some unique skill sets, I think, and I mean, one of the interesting things was, obviously we brought a lot of teams to be part of the Cyber Fusion Center, Risk Operations Center. I will say, while the SOC runs 24/7, the Risk Operations Center is really a Monday through Friday kind of business, right? Like, ideally, that's kind of their work time. Although we would bring components if there was an active incident that we were working and we needed their expertise. But I think, the skill sets that you need are really someone who has a deep understanding of vulnerabilities and can do significant research on vulnerabilities, because again, we're talking, tens, if not hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities will exist in your environment. And again, like the easy thing that we all tried to do in the past was just to say, well, if it hits this CVSS score, do something. Well, that's really not an accurate prediction of risk to you. And so you need someone who understands, how is that vulnerability exploited? Does that vulnerability exist, and how does it exist in our environment? Oftentimes, vulnerabilities are predicated on certain steps happening or certain other software being available or configurations made to make it exploitable. And so someone has to be, technically skilled at doing that research. And then I think, you have that traditionally in your vulnerability management team. And then the part that we had to bring is what I would say is really the operational rigor that more of our SOC and incident response team has. So if you've ever managed or worked in a SOC, right, to be effective, you run a playbook, right? And that playbook is based on the incident that's happening and the steps that should be taken. Well, we had to adopt those playbooks really to our vulnerability management program, right? And to make them much more actionable. And so, the vulnerability management team had to become kind of triage analysts, right? How do I triage this? How do I take it to the next step? What is the workflow? So they had to really develop more of, that kind of incident response mentality and core skill set. And then a big part of that too is kind of the business context was missing on the team. And I think while I understand our business because I tend to be a senior leader and involved in things, but I realize that our vulnerability management and our risk operations center didn't necessarily understand our business. And what I mean by that and I think Sumedh hinted on it a little bit, you do have to make risk-informed decisions. And so for me, it is, okay, what are the most important applications to run Qualys, right? And if this application is down or gets compromised, what does that mean? Who's impacted? Which business unit? Is it going to cost us revenue? Is it going to cost us an SEC report? Similar at the federal level, listen, is it going to impact the war fighters? Is it going to, impact the law enforcement person on the street, the provider? Is it more of a back office issue? But without that business context, how do they then prioritize those vulnerabilities? Because if not, they're just going back. And so we actually had to step back and almost just do a whole just business kind of education, right? So like which applications feed which functions, what is the mission, what are all of the components that make that up, and really do a training kind of level set for these pretty junior vulnerability analysts.
Yeah. So is it safe to say that there were no additional resources that were needed to operate a risk operations center? It was more about reskilling or retooling and using the existing resources to really just apply them in a more risk-informed way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no new skill sets. It was actually kind of a merging, reskilling of skills, talent into the same person. Change of mindset was a big part of it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no new people were at it to create this group.
Yeah. So my observation, looking so Cyber Fusion Center, Qualys implemented a Cyber Fusion Center, and that is phenomenal. Because you have the visibility into your risk operations center, the network operations center, and the security operations center, all on a single wall. That was phenomenally done by Jonathan's team at Qualys. One of the observations that I had, particularly around Risk Operations Center, was it is more about orchestration of findings and vulnerabilities than actually responding to them in a fragmented way. Today, like Jonathan was mentioning earlier, there are different tools. Application security program is managed by a different team oftentimes. A cloud security program, infrastructure security program is managed by different teams. How do you really make these products speak the same language of risk, normalize them, and really bring that telemetry onto a single plane where you can actually make risk-informed decisions in a much, much educated and better way? That orchestration layer really needs to be put in place, which requires independent security engineers to really step out of their narrow domain of ownership and really think about holistically how this risk signal actually, what it means to the entire organization. So that mind shift was absolutely needed to operationalize the risk operations center.
That's a great point.
I will just elaborate a little further, because an example makes it really clear. Application vulnerability, a vulnerability in a code that could potentially get deployed in a container, right? That container could be spun off from a container image, could be deployed on a virtual machine. Maybe an identity has access to that virtual machine. This simple scenario, we just touched upon 5 different asset types, potentially managed, secured by 5 different tool sets. How do you stitch all of this telemetry together to recreate this scenario? That cannot be done independently with the tools that we currently operate, which is why we really need to stitch that data set together to build out this scenario and really have a risk-informed decision around this entire scenario, as opposed to responding to the signals in isolation. That's why the Risk Operations Center is really needed.
That's great. And could you just expand a little bit on how do you see it applying to like the federal structure, right? I think obviously we talk a lot to commercial entities. This is a public sector conference. So how does it relate to federal agencies?
Great question, actually. The only way to make a risk operations center successful is by decoupling it from the detection technologies, which is really important. Now, in a public sector, we hear about the federated deployments, right? There is autonomy for different agencies, state, local, and all of these are sort of operating autonomously. Now, when different agencies actually have the choice to deploy different tool sets, how do you make them work seamlessly? This is where the concept really comes in, where you really don't need to worry about who's detecting the finding, it's about what are you trying to do with the finding and how do you respond to that finding is more important, right? So collecting the telemetry from any tool set that could be potentially deployed by the agencies, bringing them onto a single plane so that they all speak the same language of risk, overlaying that with real-time threat intelligence, applying business context to it to understand what is most important, and really figuring out what the response to those risk signals really is. Right, so this the Risk Operations Center is actually a perfect solution that applies to the public sector because there are so many loosely coupled agencies that sort of collaborate and work together.
That's great. That's great. And then I think, I wanted to just kind of wrap up our session with a little bit of perspective. I was the CISO for the state of Colorado, which well, number one, like we live in such an amazing time. Like the technology and the innovation that we have available to us as security practitioners are so much better than I was first in the business. I remember my time in the Navy, sitting on an aircraft carrier, trying to download signatures for a scanner, and literally, obviously you're sharing bandwidth with weapon systems and all that, but it would take hours, and then the download would fail, and then theoretically I was supposed to pass along this report that couldn't get off the ship to anyone. Anyway, I mean, it was just so painful, right? And then moving to the state of Colorado, and again, we were a very FISMA, like I said earlier, kind of model, right? Where we decentralize. Hey, listen, the law said you're going to provide me with an annual report with a vulnerability scan attached to it, and once a year. And of course, it would always be late, and I'd have to follow up, threaten to get legislators involved, blah, blah, blah. But then I'd get this 500-page document that was already out of date, had a scan of like 2 systems, not the entire environment, and it was like, what am I supposed to do with this, right? And even that, they were complaining about how difficult it was to scan. And I think, at least in this scenario with the Risk Operations Center, if this was a capability I would have had back in the day, and it reminds me of a lot of the CDM program, right? But an ability, to continuously aggregate and normalize whatever scanner they were using, because again, we didn't dictate, right? It was very much you decide what tooling you want. You use that tooling effectively. But again, what I needed was an accurate picture to advise the governor and the legislature, what are the risks we're facing, on a monthly basis. But that wasn't available to me. Again, this technology, we looked at doing it. And the phenomenal thing, I think back to those days, right? And we put out, some requests for information, and, it was going to be this bespoke system that was going to be built for the first time. And, it was going to cost tens of millions of dollars, right, to build this system. The nice thing now is, again, like so much of this capability is existing within solutions that you own. And again, if you're a Qualys customer, again, a lot of this is built in the solution. So I just, in these federated environments where you're trying to get control, I can't think of a better investment of really looking at this concept of a risk operations center. Any parting words before I introduce the next session?
I look forward to next year's conversation around this, when we can actually share some more metrics in terms of what are the outcomes of implementing a risk operations center internally, right? So looking forward to that as well. It's all about how do you manage multiple different detection engines that are feeding into the risk operations center simultaneously, right? And the velocity at which these findings are detected is ever growing. So understanding what the capacity in the organization is to understand the treatment of these risks, right? How do we respond, patch, accept, transfer, as Sumit was mentioning earlier, it becomes really critical. So some of these outcomes could be definitely discussed next year. Looking forward to it.
Great. Well, up next, we're gonna shift topics, and actually, this is one of my favorite topics. But we're going to start focusing on software supply chain and looking at securing that supply chain. So I'd like to introduce, please join me in welcoming Courtney O'Neill Allen, who will moderate this conversation and talk about integrating security throughout the development life cycle. Thank you.